She looked at me like fire and said 4 words that stopped my heart. "Make me believe you mean it." The first time I saw her, it felt like the world had shifted slightly off its axis, just enough for me to notice things I hadn't before. The way sunlight pooled over the edge of a cafe table, the quiet hum of a jazz record spinning somewhere in the background, and the small, deliberate gestures of a woman who seemed entirely untouchable yet effortlessly magnetic. She was older, yes, by a decade or more, but that only sharpened her presence. She moved through the room with a confidence that felt natural, not performative, and yet there was something fragile in the curve of her smile that made me want to step closer, to see what lay beneath it. I was nervous, aware of the age difference, aware of the unspoken rules of approaching someone like her. But something in her gaze caught me, the briefest flicker, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, she noticed me noticing her. I found myself lingering near her table longer than I should, pretending to check my phone, pretending to adjust my coat, anything to justify the way my heartbeat had decided to live in my throat. She laughed at something across the room, a light, melodic sound that lingered longer than it should have, and I felt the strange ache of wanting to be the cause of that laughter, even for a single moment. Her eyes, dark and observant, scanned the space around her, landing momentarily on me. That fleeting connection, barely a second, was enough to leave a tiny spark smoldering in my chest. When our hands brushed, it was almost accidental. Reaching for the same paperback on the shelf, my fingers met hers. A jolt ran through me, sharp but not unpleasant, like the static of a storm just beginning. She didn't pull away immediately, and that small hesitation told me more than words could. The brush of her hand was warm, soft, and fleeting, but it left me aware of every detail. The subtle curve of her nails, the faint scent of her perfume, the light pressure she applied before letting go. My stomach knotted, and I realized that this small, almost accidental touch was more intimate than any conversation I'd ever had with someone I barely knew. I wanted to speak, to say something clever or meaningful, but my mouth felt suddenly empty, my words trapped behind the weight of my own curiosity and nerves. Instead, I offered her a smile. Tentative, awkward, but genuine, and she returned it, a little flicker of acknowledgement that left me craving more. Everything about her drew me in. The warmth of her presence, the subtle power in her movements, the quiet confidence that suggested she had lived through things I could only imagine. I left the cafe that day with a strange mixture of exhilaration and frustration. I didn't know her yet, but I wanted to. I didn't know if she noticed me enough to care. But somehow, even that first glance, that first brush of hands, made me certain that my life would feel a little emptier if I didn't try to find out. That was the spark. Not a lightning strike, not a sudden eruption, but a quiet, persistent ember that promised fire if I dared to fan it. And I knew, even then, that meeting her had changed the rhythm of my heartbeat in a way that nothing else ever had. After that first fleeting encounter, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Her presence lingered in my mind like a song I couldn't forget. The subtle sway of her posture, the soft cadence of her laugh, the way her eyes seemed to measure the world carefully, and yet always returned to me, if only for a heartbeat. I didn't know her name, or if I even had the right to try to speak to her, but the pull toward her felt undeniable. The next time our paths crossed, it was almost cinematic in its ordinariness. A corner cafe, mid-afternoon, the smell of roasted coffee beans thick in the air. She was sitting by the window, sunlight catching her hair in golden highlights, a book open in front of her, the tip of her pen lightly tapping against the page as she wrote notes in careful, deliberate handwriting. I hesitated for a moment by the counter, pretending to glance at the pastries, feeling my chest tighten in anticipation. When she looked up and noticed me, it wasn't the fleeting spark of curiosity from before. There was a small, almost teasing glimmer in her gaze, a hint that she remembered me. I smiled awkwardly, unsure whether to approach or retreat, and in that pause, something shifted. She closed her book with a soft thud and gestured toward the empty seat across from her. My heart jumped. Sitting down felt both natural and terrifying. I was aware of the age gap, of the world's expectations, of my own insecurities, but none of that seemed to matter in the quiet warmth of her presence. Our conversation began slowly, measured at first, exploring small, safe topics. The book she was reading, the cafe's peculiar charm, the way the light fell differently at this hour. But her words carried depth. She had a way of speaking that drew you in, layering subtle humor with gentle challenges, testing the waters without ever seeming to judge. I found myself sharing more than I intended, words spilling out in the way they do when someone notices the small things about you. The way you fidget with your hands when you're nervous, the way your voice hesitates before saying something meaningful. She listened, really listened, leaning forward slightly, tilting her head, brushing her hair back behind her ear in a gesture that was casual, yet intimate. I caught myself staring at the curve of her jaw, the warmth of her smile, the way she exuded confidence without arrogance. There were small touches, almost accidental, that made my pulse spike. She rested her hand briefly on mine while reaching for her cup, or lightly brushed my sleeve while laughing at something I said. Each moment carried a quiet intensity that neither of us acknowledged outright, but it was there, simmering beneath the surface. By the time we parted that day, I felt as if I had crossed an invisible line. The spark from before had grown into a steady flame, fueled by laughter, curiosity, and a subtle intimacy neither of us fully understood yet. Walking away, I could still feel the ghost of her hand on mine, the warmth of her gaze lingering in my mind. I didn't know where this connection would lead, but for the first time, I realized that wanting someone like her, someone so out of reach yet so present, wasn't just a passing feeling. It was the beginning of something I couldn't ignore. After our initial encounters, the spark between us had grown into something more tangible, yet equally fragile. I found myself thinking about her constantly, her laugh echoing in quiet moments, the way she absent-mindedly tucked her hair behind her ear, the intensity behind her eyes that seemed to look straight into the parts of me I usually kept hidden. But as drawn as I was to her, there was a growing awareness that she wasn't easy to read. Beneath her confident exterior, there were walls, carefully constructed and perhaps justified, that no one seemed to breach. Our next meeting happened unexpectedly, in a quiet park, the kind of place where conversations slow down naturally and distractions fade into the background. She was seated on a bench, her coat draped neatly over her shoulders, eyes following the flight of a bird across the late afternoon sky. I approached cautiously, my steps soft against the crunching leaves. She looked up, and for a brief moment, the air seemed to hold its breath. We spoke at first in small exchanges, but then the conversation deepened. She shared glimpses of her past, not in dramatic bursts, but in careful, measured phrases that hinted at vulnerability. I listened, acutely aware of the emotional gravity in her words, afraid to say the wrong thing yet compelled to respond with honesty. When she mentioned moments of loneliness, of regret, of choices made and roads not taken, I felt a mixture of admiration and protectiveness. Here was someone so self-assured, yet carrying silent burdens that added layers to her presence. I noticed the subtle ways she revealed herself. A flicker of hesitation before answering a question, a slight tremor in her fingers as she sipped her tea, the way her eyes darted to mine and lingered just a moment too long before looking away. Each movement, each pause, felt deliberate yet intimate, as if she was testing whether I could meet her where she was without judgment. The tension between us had shifted. It was no longer just curiosity or attraction. It had become something more nuanced, a recognition of emotional stakes. Silent moments between our words were heavy, charged with a longing neither of us spoke aloud. I wanted to bridge the space between us but feared misreading her signals. When our hands brushed as she handed me a notebook she'd been using, the brief contact was electric. She didn't pull away immediately, letting the moment hang, a silent question lingering in the air. I realized then that I wasn't just drawn to her physical presence or her confidence. I was drawn to the entirety of her. The woman she was, shaped by experiences I could only guess at, and the vulnerability she chose to reveal in fragments. The connection was no longer casual. It carried weight. Each conversation left me thinking, wondering, questioning how someone so composed could also be so achingly human. Walking away from that bench, I felt the pull stronger than ever. I didn't just want to know her. I wanted to understand her, to be someone who could earn her trust, someone she could rely on without hesitation. The spark had matured into embers of something deeper, and I knew that the path ahead wouldn't be simple, but it was worth every uncertain step. The subtle warmth between us had grown into something undeniable, but with that intimacy came an unspoken tension. She was no longer just intriguing. She had become a mirror, reflecting my own fears and insecurities back at me. I could feel it in her gaze, the way her eyes would flicker with something unspoken, the almost imperceptible raise of her brow when she suspected I was holding back. She wasn't testing me with words yet. She was testing me with presence, with silence, with that quiet, unyielding expectation that I rise to meet her. It was during an evening at her apartment, a place filled with muted light and the faint scent of old books and citrus candles, that the challenge finally made itself clear. We had been talking for hours, about everything and nothing. Movies we loved, music that resonated with us, memories that seemed both distant and intimate. Yet beneath the easy laughter and shared stories, there was a current of something heavier. She leaned back slightly on the couch, crossing her legs, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, almost daring me to step closer. "You talk a lot about understanding people," she said quietly, brushing her hair over her shoulder. "But do you understand what it takes to really mean what you say?" The question wasn't accusatory, but it hit harder than I expected. It wasn't about knowledge or charm. It was about sincerity, about proving, through words and action, that I could navigate the layers of who she was without faltering. My pulse quickened. I wanted to respond immediately, to reassure her with clever lines or heartfelt promises. But she was testing more than my words. She was testing my presence, my patience, my ability to hold her trust without rushing, without overstepping. Every pause in her voice, every subtle shift in her posture, carried weight. The room felt smaller, the silence heavier, and every glance between us seemed to hum with anticipation. There were small gestures that heightened the tension. Her hand rested lightly on the arm of the couch, a hair's breadth from mine, and I felt the almost electric weight of proximity. She didn't pull away, but neither did she close the gap. The touch was an unspoken dare, a challenge to see if I could meet her where she was, emotionally and sincerely, without faltering. And then she leaned forward slightly, eyes locking with mine, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to vibrate through the room. "Make me believe you mean it." Those words, for simple words, carried more gravity than any dramatic confession could. They demanded more than charm or impulsive emotion. They demanded truth, commitment, and courage. My heartbeat hammered, my mind raced, and yet I knew that the path forward wasn't about overthinking. It was about presence, attention, and honesty. In that moment, I realized that the challenge wasn't hers alone. It was mine too, to prove myself, not through grand gestures, but through patience, sincerity, and small, meaningful actions. She had given me the opportunity to step closer, to earn her trust, and the weight of that responsibility made every breath feel heavier, every movement more deliberate. Leaving her that night, I carried those words with me, their echo settling deep in my chest. I wasn't just infatuated anymore. I was challenged, inspired, and terrified in equal measure. The spark had grown into a slow-burning fire, and I knew that to win her trust and her heart, I had to meet her challenge head-on. After the challenge she'd set, there was a new layer to our connection. A tension that had shifted from quiet curiosity to something more intimate, more tender. It wasn't about words anymore. It was about presence, the subtle energy that thrummed between us whenever we shared the same space. I found myself noticing the smallest details. The way her fingers lingered over the rim of a coffee cup, the faint brush of her hair across her cheek, or the way she tilted her head when listening to something that mattered. Every nuance was magnified, and every pause between us carried its own weight. It happened one evening during a long walk through the city streets, the world bathed in golden streetlights, the air cool and crisp. There was a soft drizzle, the kind that didn't soak you but made everything glisten, turning the streets into reflective ribbons of light. She was beside me, our steps in quiet synchrony, and for a moment it felt like the world had shrunk to just the two of us. Her coat brushed mine occasionally, an almost imperceptible contact that sent small jolts of awareness through me. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, subtle yet unmistakable, and I realized I was acutely aware of every inch of proximity between us. We talked about trivial things at first, books we were reading, songs that lingered in our minds, but the conversation slowly bled into something deeper. She spoke about small regrets and fleeting moments of doubt, and I shared fragments of my own uncertainty, the things I rarely let anyone see. In those moments, there was no teasing or testing, just a quiet reciprocity, a mutual acknowledgement of vulnerability. The way she listened, eyes soft and attentive, made me feel seen in a way that was both comforting and terrifying. Then, as if guided by instinct, our hands met. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden grab, no forced closeness, but natural, almost inevitable. Fingers intertwined lightly, hesitant at first, then firmer, lingering longer than necessary. I felt her warmth through the fabric of her gloves, the subtle pressure of her grip, a silent reassurance and a question all at once. Neither of us spoke, we didn't need to. The contact said everything we weren't ready to voice yet. Her smile broke the quiet tension, small and private, as though sharing a secret meant only for us. I caught her gaze, and in that fleeting moment, the world beyond the streetlights and the drizzle didn't exist. It was just us, suspended in an intimacy that was more than physical. It was emotional, tender, and profoundly human. When the walk ended, and we stood beneath a softly glowing street lamp, she didn't pull away. Our hands remained lightly linked, a quiet acknowledgement of the closeness we'd just shared. Even the smallest gestures, a brush of her fingers, a tilt of her head toward mine, felt charged with meaning. It was the first time I truly understood that slow-burning connection, that unspoken desire tempered by patience and respect, could be more intoxicating than any overt declaration of love. That night, walking home with her presence still lingering in my chest, I realized that this moment of closeness had changed everything. It was no longer just about attraction or curiosity. It was about trust, intimacy, and the unspoken promise that we were inching closer to something neither of us could deny. By now, the quiet warmth and shared moments between us had evolved into something heavier, more urgent, an emotional current neither of us could ignore. Every glance, every accidental brush of hands, carried weight. The playful teasing and tentative touches of earlier encounters had matured into a charged awareness, and beneath the surface, both of us knew that the unspoken question had arrived. Could this connection survive honesty? Could it endure truth? It was an evening drenched in golden hour light, the kind that softens edges and makes ordinary spaces feel intimate and intimate spaces feel sacred. She had invited me to her apartment again, ostensibly to look over a project she was working on. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt the air shift. The scent of her perfume mingled with the faint aroma of her candles, warm and familiar, creating a cocooned space removed from the outside world. She stood near the window, one hand resting lightly on the sill, eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. We talked at first about trivialities, about the way light hit the room, about music we'd been listening to, but even as the words flowed, there was an undercurrent, a tension that neither of us could ignore. Her gaze would settle on me, steady and searching, as if she were weighing the honesty behind every word I spoke. I felt exposed in the most intimate way. My intentions, my desires, my vulnerabilities laid bare without a single question. Then, in that charged silence, she leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a husky whisper that seemed to echo off the walls. "Make me believe you mean it," for words, but they carried the weight of every hesitation, every fear, every longing that had simmered between us. My heart slammed against my ribs, a mix of fear and exhilaration. This was the moment I had been unknowingly preparing for, the point where all my sincerity, all my attention to her small, intimate signals would be tested. I didn't speak immediately. Instead, I let my eyes meet hers, tracing the subtle flicker of vulnerability behind her confident exterior. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for her hand, brushing my thumb across her knuckles. She didn't pull away. Her gaze softened, and a faint smile curved her lips, almost imperceptible, yet charged with meaning. Every hesitation, every small gesture, was a conversation in itself. I spoke then, not with rehearsed words, but with honesty. About my admiration for her strength, my fascination with her presence, my desire to meet her vulnerability with my own. I told her I didn't just want to be near her. I wanted to understand her, support her, and cherish the trust she allowed me to earn. Her breath hitched slightly, a quiet acknowledgement that my words had landed where they needed to. Finally, she let herself lean closer, her hand resting against mine, bridging the physical and emotional distance we'd maintained. That single, deliberate act dissolved the tension that had been building for weeks, replacing it with something warm, grounding, and real. In that moment, we weren't testing boundaries or weighing risks. We were simply acknowledging the truth we'd both been holding back. That what we felt for each other was real, meaningful, and worth the patience, the risk, and the trust. The emotional climax wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, intimate, and profoundly human. The spark had finally ignited into a flame, and neither of us could deny the warmth it brought. The night after the unspoken confessions, there was a quietness between us that felt different, lighter, warmer, yet heavy with meaning. The weight of uncertainty that had lingered for so long had begun to dissolve, replaced by a fragile but undeniable sense of connection. I realized that the slow burn we had nurtured, every glance, every brush of hands, every lingering pause, had led us here, to a place where presence mattered more than words, where trust and understanding carried more weight than grand gestures. We met again in her apartment, a place that now felt like a sanctuary rather than a private stage for testing hearts. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp, the shadows folding around her like an embrace. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, her posture relaxed but her eyes still searching, still assessing. I could feel my own heartbeat steadying as I stepped closer, conscious of the space between us and yet drawn toward it. The conversation began casually, teasing remarks about the day, small anecdotes meant to bridge the ordinary. But beneath the surface, there was an understanding, an unspoken agreement that everything had shifted. Every word, every glance, carried the warmth and intimacy we had built over countless shared moments. I could see it in the way she tilted her head toward me, the faint curve of her lips, the subtle tension in her shoulders easing as she allowed herself to simply exist in my presence. Then came the quiet, unforced closeness we had been moving toward for weeks. We sat together on the couch, close enough that our shoulders brushed, close enough that the warmth between us was tangible. I could feel her hand resting lightly on my arm, the simple contact grounding me, affirming everything I had hoped for without a single word being spoken. Our eyes met, and in that gaze was a mixture of relief, trust, and the deep, unspoken understanding that we had crossed an invisible threshold. There was no dramatic declaration, no need for grand confessions. Instead, our connection was affirmed in the small, deliberate moments. The way our fingers intertwined effortlessly, the way she leaned her head slightly toward mine, the gentle pressure of her hand lingering against mine as if to say, "I trust you. I'm here." The slow burn that had carried us through hesitation, longing, and quiet tension now flared into warmth. A steady, grounding presence that felt both new and familiar. We laughed softly at nothing in particular, sharing the comfortable silence that comes only after honesty and trust have been earned. Every glance, every movement, was imbued with intimacy, the kind that doesn't need words because it speaks through presence, through touch, through the quiet acknowledgement of hearts aligning. When the night drew to a close, we didn't rush to part ways. We remained close, fingers still laced together, foreheads brushing lightly, sharing the quiet joy of having found something rare and profound. I realized that this resolution wasn't about endings. It was about beginnings, the start of a connection rooted in patience, sincerity, and understanding, a bond that would continue to grow with care and attention. As I left that night, her hand lingering in mine, I knew the slow burn had become a steady flame. The challenge, the tension, and the vulnerability had led us here, to a place of trust, warmth, and quiet, lasting intimacy. And in that moment, I understood fully that this was only the beginning of something deeply human, profoundly moving, and entirely worth the wait. If you felt the sparks, the tension, or the quiet moments between them, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that pulls at your heart. And comment below which part of their connection spoke to you the most.